Think, for example, again, of a holiday, such as, I'll use the Thanksgiving example again. This is now 2009. Thanksgiving is approaching. I could, of course, say, well, you know, Thanksgiving is one day. You know, it's perhaps less than a day. Probably in 10 years or 15 years ago from now, I'm not going to remember Thanksgiving. This particular Thanksgiving, it'll blur in my memory just like Thanksgiving 1994, Thanksgiving 2003. I can't really distinguish any of those in my memory anymore. Does the fact that Thanksgiving in 2003 no longer has meaning and significance for me that's indistinguishable from the other ones mean that it wasn't valuable? The point should be, of course not. And for the exact same reason that Thanksgiving is only going to be a day and it's going to be forgotten in the years to come, that should not properly detract from the actual value that Thanksgiving has. The value that things have is temporal. The amount of time that the value each thing has might be short, it might simply be a day, but that is the value that it has, and we should be able to embrace it and appreciate it and commit to the value despite the temporal limitations. Temporality, the finiteness of time is built into the value of things. Same thing, for example, we might say about a spring flower. We can go out on a beautiful spring day, there's a lovely flower that is blooming. Intellectually, we will know tomorrow that flower will fade, it will no longer bloom, it will start to decompose. What's the important thing here? That the flower tomorrow will not be beautiful, or that today the flower is beautiful. The fact of the beauty of the flower today is the value to be found, and we should be able to focus on that and enjoy the flower for what it is in all of its beauty. The same thing then holds for our lives. We span perhaps several decades here. The fact that we may not be around to enjoy life or to commit to life a century or 2 centuries from now, that's not the point to focus on. The point to focus on is we're alive now, we have value that we can commit to, we have beauty, meaning, significance that we can create in the world. Do it. That's the existentialist project. So those 3 things as guidelines I think are useful here in thinking about existentialist value. Value is first personal, not impersonal. Value is created through commitment. It's not something that happens to you passively. And then finally, value is, by the nature of the world, finite in time. We should not spend our lives pining for immortality and some sort of infinite value. One more anecdote I want to run by you in closing our discussion here of existentialism as a philosophy comes from a philosopher who is not actually an existentialist philosopher, Abraham Maslow. He's a psychologist in terms of his reputation, most of his work being in that field. But he does have one discovery, one story that he tells based on researches that he does that has a very existentialist flavor, or at least one that I think existentialists would embrace. It involves the concept of the post-mortem life. Now, it's a paradoxical label here. Post-mortem means after death, so life after death, but what Maslow means by that is not the traditional religious notion of your soul separating from your body and having a life after death. What he means is the kind of life that he observed some of the patients and people whom he studied who had had very close brushes with death. As it happens, Maslow had made a point of studying a number of men, most of them in their 50s, who had had very severe heart attacks. And they had come this close from dying. But as it happens, they did not die, they recovered, and what Maslow noted is that almost without exception, the way those middle-aged men went on to live their lives for the rest of their lives was very different than the way they had been living their lives in, say, the decade leading up to their having a heart attack in their 50s. What had happened in their 40s and in their early 50s leading up to their heart attack was they all would say as well, you know, it wasn't that my life was bad, but I really felt locked in. I really felt I had all these responsibilities. I really felt that I wasn't free. You know, I had the mortgage to worry about, maybe a second mortgage, and I had my boss, and I had all these responsibilities at work, and the pressure, and my marriage, and the kids, and college bills, right, and so on. I felt locked in, like I really couldn't be the kind of person that I wanted to be, and then all of that, you know, eventually built up, and then the guy had a heart attack. Now, after the heart attack, though, Maslow noticed that almost all of these guys, they started to do things that they didn't do before. They reconnected with their wives and rebuilt romance and eroticism into their lives. They reconnected with their kids. They forgave old enemies. Maybe they quit their jobs and tried something entrepreneurially. Maybe they went, with their doctors say so, skydiving and tried all sorts of physical things that they said maybe I'll get around to right at some point. In fact, they were acting freely, and they were making all kinds of new commitments and connections and building, right, a meaningful life, right, for themselves. And then Maslow was struck by this, and he's asking, why are they doing this after the heart attack, and why were they not doing this, right, before the heart attack? And so he put that question to the men, and all of the men would come back with an answer, something like the following. They said, well, I had the heart attack. And then when I recovered from the heart attack, and I had that all the time lying around thinking about my life and what I was going to do, I realized I came this close from being dead. I could very easily have been dead. And so what I realized was that really all of the life that I have now, however much life of that, I treat it as a gift. It's like something that I can experiment with. I can try new things, and I haven't really lost anything because I could very easily have been dead as a result of the heart attack. So the heart attack ended up being liberating, and it wasn't that they now are actually freer than they were before they had the heart attack. Instead, they now are thinking of themselves as freer. They're realizing they're not really locked in, that at any moment of their lives they can make a choice to continue to stay in the rut that they found themselves in, or to make a choice to go off in a different direction. And Maslow's point is that for all of us, and this would be the existentialist point, we could and should not wait until we're 55 and have a heart attack to have this philosophical realization. Any one of us, of course, could be struck down at any moment. We could be hit by a bus, we could be hit by a lightning, we could be subject of a terrorist attack and so forth. And of course, we all feel like we're Sisyphus rolling various boulders up the hill in various respects and that we're locked in various ways. We're not. We're free. We are making choices, and the choices that we have been making, we are free to make different choices. We're free to take on new commitments. We're free, just like the men who had the heart attacks, to create a meaningful life for ourselves, whatever we as individuals think a meaningful life is. That's the project.